This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Well, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. It's Wednesday, November 1st, 2023. I'm Lee Bortons, and today we're also joined by CCMM curriculum developer Brittany Lewis. Jennifer, why don't you tell us about this month's show?
Yeah, so this month we're going to be exploring the ancient classics, and I think it's a good month to start just snuggling up and reading because it's getting colder. Fall and winter are great times to read. So we'll discuss ancient classics all month, and we're going to have a little assistance from Peter Leithart's book, Heroes of the City of Man, which is a commentary on a lot of these ancient Greek classics. So through his book and our discussions, we'll look at Hesiod's Theogony, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, I can't talk today, Virgil's Aeneid, and Homer's Odyssey. And then on Thanksgiving week, we are going to take a break and have a short episode on the Mayflower Compact in honor of our Thanksgiving holiday. So
that'll be fun. So you can access all our past podcasts on at Lee Bortons on my YouTube channel. And also you can go to my website, leebortons.com, in order to get links to any of the books that we are reading if you want to purchase them, as well as to other shows that I help to promote. All right, so Jennifer, let's get started.
All right, so my first question is always the same, except this time I have to ask you about two books instead of one. This is like a bonus episode. So let's start first with Peter Leithart's Heroes of the City of Man, and you tell us why that's in the curriculum, and then when you are good on that topic, tell us why Hesiod's Theogony made it its way into our curriculum.
So all this has to do with the origin story of classical conversations. One of the reasons that I ended up putting the communities together was I realized that as voracious a reader as I thought I was, and as well-educated I thought I was well schooled. And so as a classical Christian, I wanted to read Shakespeare with Robert and John, and found out none of us could, that we really were not steeped in literature. And a lot of it was because we didn't know who or what Shakespeare is referring to. So I got Peter Leithart's book, The Brightest Heaven of Invention, and read Charles and Mary Lamb's version of Shakespeare. And together we went to work, and it did work. So when I discovered that Peter Leithart also had a book on ancient literature, which was at that time inaccessible to our family, we went ahead and purchased that and began working through the literature he suggested. And of course, Theogony is one of the books in there. So it was from just a desire to do better for my children and recognizing my inadequacy and not being, I won't give up when it comes to my children. So if I don't know something, I'm gonna find a way to learn it and hopefully do it with them at the same time. So that's really why it's in the curriculum. It turned out Theogony is a good one to start with, and Mr. Leithart was smart because by working through that smaller book about that, well, we'll talk about the title in a minute, but by working through that book, it made it so we were introduced to the names of a lot of the Greek gods that we were going to meet in other literature. And so it was a good grammatical setup for the deeper conversations in the poetic books that we were going to read.
Nice. Well, I want to emphasize two of the things that you said that I think are really important. One is never underestimate the power of a homeschool parent when they want to give their kids something that they don't quite possess. So we talk a lot in classical conversations about being lead learners and also about finding resources for ourselves and for our kids. And there are so many out there. So Leithart's book is a great example. But really, if we put our minds to it, we can get through any material with our kids, and we can find guides, whether those are living persons or books, we can find guides to help us. So I appreciated that testimony from you. And the second thing I wanted to emphasize is that you read some children's versions of Shakespeare. And in that same spirit, we have republished some public domain books at Classical Conversations that have stories from the Greek epics. So we have Ancient World Echoes, and we have some stories from the Roman Empire in our series that starts with Kings of Rome. So children's books are a great way to get started on a really hard, something that seems remote to you. Reading a children's version is great.
Oh, good.
Well, good. So Tim, this is kind of a weird title, Theogony. What in the world does this word mean?
Yeah, theogony is two Greek roots put together. One of them is really familiar to us, theo or theo, right? From which we get theology, is pertaining to God. And the other half is an unusual root, gony, gony, comes from or means generation. So the title of the book is what the book is. It's the generations of the gods, the Greek gods in this case. So Hesiod wrote this theogony, but there are others. There's a theogony of the Hindu gods. So it tends to be these sort of family tree and origin stories of pantheons. The Greek word here was used for the first time actually in 1612 in English, and it was used by a man named John Selden, who was a lawyer and historian, and he got some big shout out from John Milton, in the bard, the bard, apart from Shakespeare, the greatest influenced English literature, and Milton said that John Selden was the chief of learned men in England in his day, which is pretty high praise from a guy as learned himself as Milton. But yeah, the theogony was really important in Greek literature. It influenced Aeschylus, and then later influenced Ovid in Roman literature, obviously down to Milton's day, and even to today, a lot of stories that you see are just retellings of these ancient stories.
Yeah, it's especially interesting when we talk about Paradise Lost. For us, that's our Christian epic, and Milton definitely does a similar kind of work as he attributes all the demons to these gods of different tribes. So very interesting. Okay, so I have a follow-up question for you, Tim. Are we saying it wrong? Is it theogony or theogony?
It's theogony. Was actually just talking with my children about this the other day. I think that even in English words, the only time that G says ja is when it's followed by an E, right? Like in George or right. Otherwise, we always use it as a hard G and not the soft G. So, but in any case, this is from the Greek, and the Greek root would definitely use a hard G sound. So it is theogony.
Okay. Well, I am glad to know that. So one of the, as Tim pointed out, this is giving us all the origins of the Greek gods, and our students make a chart. It's like a genealogy chart of the Greek gods, which is a very fun project. I know Brittany has led Challenge 4 a number of times. Do you have any testimonies about your students and our chart of the gods that you want to share, Brittany?
Well, yes. My students have always wrestled with making that genealogy chart, and have found that fidelity has some really great reasons. One of the reasons we ought to be faithful is because it really helps our family trees not look like Zeus's, which is like spaghetti and really hard to follow because he doesn't have one wife and he has all kinds of affairs, and wrestling with that is something that students often recognize and are grateful for.
Yeah, mine definitely had that same conclusion. They were not very nice to Zeus once they started looking at his family tree. They had a lot to say about his morality and practices. So good. Well, one of the questions that often comes up when we look at classical Christian education, or even the classical conversations curriculum, is, why should Christians spend so much time reading these pagan epics? So I thought we'd all take a minute to share our views on that. So anyone want to kick us off?
Well, I'll start. We read them because they're also in the scriptures. There are 5 gods explicitly mentioned in the scriptures, in the New Testament: Zeus, Hermes, Castor, Pollux, and Artemis. And there's other ones referred to. Aphrodite's referred to. One of the followers of Paul was a woman with that name, Aphrodite, and it's a slightly different spelling that means belonging to Aphrodite. And so these are the followers. They were steeped in Greek culture, followers of Paul and Peter, trying to understand who Jesus was. And they're talked about. So I want to know what they knew.
I agree with that. I was thinking about Moses being given an Egyptian education and Daniel and his friends receiving a Chaldean education. And then we know in Paul obviously knew enough Greek poetry to quote it and to attribute truth to it in Acts 17 and other places.
Yeah, and
so
piggybacking
that's why I
off,
want to know.
oh, sorry, Brittany.
No, go ahead.
Piggybacking off what Brittany was just saying about Paul, it's interesting if you look at the way Paul addresses different audiences as he talks to them in the book of Acts and in the epistles, and you see that he uses those pagan myths and pagan practices as things to bounce off of, and not to incorporate them into Christianity, but to show them how wrong they are, right? That they got close, but they missed so completely. I think about Paul on Mars Hill, where he says, yeah, you worship this unknown God, like all these other gods you have here on the hill. But let me tell you about the real God who you should be worshiping, that is unknown to you, but shouldn't be. And it's a great way to take and make use of these false beliefs for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah. And I think it is interesting for us to note that this is not a new question. Should Christians read the ancient epics? All the way back, the church fathers were asking this question. And so we often hear about Tertullian asking, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And we also hear answers by the church father Basil, saying that we can, his metaphor that he used was that it's like, just as the Israelites, when they left Egypt, plundered the treasures of the Egyptians in order to build the tabernacle, so we as Christians can plunder these treasures of the Greeks in order to have that full-orbed education. So does anyone want to add to what that ancient conversation looked like?
Yeah, that's.
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Brittany.
No, you go ahead, please. I'd rather hear what you have to say.
Yeah, that very talk that you were referencing, Basil the Great talks about it like a bee that goes from flower to flower, taking only what's good, right? The good nectar from each flower to go on, and avoiding the bad. And I think he even refers to some as poison, right? To stay away from the things that are no good, but to take the things that are good. And I think that's a lovely image too for us, that when we read like Brittany was just talking about Zeus's family tree and his infidelity, we can use that as a counterpoint to what our God is like, who is always faithful. Whereas we can learn things about the heart of man from these ancient myths, because man's heart has always been the same.
So good. That's why I love bees. I think about that metaphor a lot as a homeschool mom. My daughters and I recently gave little bee rings with bees on them to women and young women who we know are learners, who continue to learn and share what they're learning with us as a sign of encouragement, that we could be like the bees. I think Shakespeare and Milton did that too. Like they took some of these old stories and they made honey with them and gave us beautiful poetry in their plays and epics that we get to read.
Yeah.
So we're downstream from that conversation, which is good for us to know about.
All scriptures are full of idols and adultery. I mean, even the Old Testament, when Isaac's wife, when she was leaving her father's household, sat on hid her family idols under her saddle as she was riding, and the statues during Nebuchadnezzar's time falling over. I mean, we need to tell our children what these things in the scriptures mean, And a smart child will say, well, who was that person they were referring to? And so it helps if we can be ready with an answer for the things that are in the scriptures. It would be like to me saying, well, just because I don't have any sheep, I shouldn't learn what a shepherd is in order to understand the Psalm 23 better.
Mhm.
It all goes together.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's
their
good.
stories are fun and they're human.
They are. And it's interesting because we often think that they are lofty or disconnected from us. But usually what I find with students is that the further back the story is, the better they engage with it. Sometimes it's the literature that's closest to them that is puzzling and difficult to read. Whereas these old stories have stood the test of time, and there's some level of familiarity, and there's definitely a level of the universal nature of the meaning of the stories. And in the case of the Greek epics, we're helped by the fact that they're very much like modern day superhero movies. So they have an immediate connection there. So, well, one of the answers, I think, to our question that we were just exploring about Christians and the epics is that we are often comparing. So while the students are reading Theogony, they are also reading Genesis. And I know in my Challenge 4 class, we had a great comparison chart between the Greek gods and the Greek myths of creation and the Genesis account. So I thought we could do that here today. And I have made us a very basic comparison chart. We shall see if I can keep up with you as you add things to it. But I thought it would be helpful to see it as we go. So it's very, very, very basic. It is exactly what I would put on the whiteboard. All right. So one thing that Tim has already given us is that we have this faithlessness of Zeus versus the faithfulness of God. So I thought I'd get that on there before I forgot it. What else do you guys see when you compare these two accounts of the world?
Well, like
And
the
both-
dumbness of the statues that Paul criticizes, dumb, D-U-M-B, versus the spoken word of our living God.
Nice.
In both accounts, order is brought out of chaos.
I didn't make my middle column for things that are the same, so I'll just have to improvise here. I'll just
Well,
put
but in one case, it happens amongst the gods or as part of the gods, and in the other case, it's that the order is brought forth by God. So there is a distinction between the two for sure.
Okay, I'll say, maybe it's that. Are you saying that the Greek gods didn't have as much agency in it? They weren't the cause?
Yeah, because the first of the gods, right, was the first thing that was ordered, right? Chaos gave birth to one of the gods. So it makes it's a very related but a very different story at the same time.
Also, in the Genesis account, order is out of nothing too, which is, I don't think is really stated in Theogony. I think it begins with chaos. It's like born out of it, which is interesting.
It's almost big bangish in that there's this explosion, that's the chaos. So evolution is not a new idea from Darwin. It's been around since forever.
Well,
there's also
go ahead, Brittany.
Oh, sorry. That there's also battles between the gods. I mean, like there's conflict and more chaos, I think, created by the gods until one conquers another one. Where I guess any kind of battle is not always between flesh and blood and also caused by the fall in Genesis.
Yeah.
What do you do about the battle between God and Satan? And of course, Satan loses.
Yes. You don't have that. The next generation conquering the last generation of the gods in Genesis.
Right. But you do have in both stories the commingling of the the immaterial with the material, right? In the Greek myth, you have these demigods, and in Genesis, you have the sons, right? The sons of God who come and mingle with men, the daughters of men, and create the Nephilim.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Both of them recount the creation of the first woman.
Yes. I'm laughing because it's not a very pleasant thing in Theogony. She's a punishment. So
Yeah, some would argue in both cases that trouble entered the world with both.
why does it
I
feel
think
worse
the
to me? I was trying to figure that out when I was reading that with my students. It feels worse to me what is said in the Theogony. There's that sense, I think, partially that Eve is also created in the image of God, whereas in the Theogony, it's this woman is a curse on man.
Yeah, woman is the completion of man in the Genesis account, right? Man is not good without woman.
she's the glory of the glory.
Nice.
There's Tartarus in both. I think the Titans are cast into Tartarus and Theogony, and then the fallen angels. I think Second Peter talks about our cast. It's kind of interesting.
Is Hermes or Mercury in Theogony? I can't remember.
Oh gosh, Brittany
I
has her.
think so. Yeah.
The reason why I was thinking that in some ways because angels are messengers and Hermes is the messenger of that contrast. But I can't remember if he's in there or
not. Looking down the long list of names.
This is while you're looking, I'll say it might be a slight tangent, but I don't think so. That last week, with my students, we looked at Psalm 1 and the difference. And I think we talked about this here in the book club, but we looked at the difference between blessedness and happiness. And particularly thinking that my students were very, very struck by just the fleeting nature of the God's favor in the Greek epics versus the absolute faithfulness of God, and that idea of being blessed and rooted in him versus temporarily the gods come down and shower their favor on you, and then the next god battles against that, and then the favor might be removed. And so that was a huge insight for them as we were comparing these two things.
What do you think about the visible versus the invisible? In other words, I'm thinking about how so many visible things are named after Greek or Roman gods, like Saturn and Castor and Pollux, the stars, and they were attaching those to something they could see that seemed bigger than themselves, versus in scripture, we're kind of forbidden to do that with our God. Yeah.
Yeah, and that idea of their art. I mean, there's a reason why the Greeks had so much statuary, and the Hebrew tabernacle was decorated with pomegranates and lilies, and right there, that idea of not making graven images. So, well, I believe it or not, we are halfway through, so I'm going to stop. That was a very good comparison chart for as quickly as we did it. Very good job. So, all right, Lee, you want to give us our commercial break?
Okay. Well, I just want to make sure we thank classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed today and all year long can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to classical conversation books in order for you to purchase them. And of course, you can listen to the older podcasts that we've had at Lee Bortons. So next week, we're going to continue our exploration of the ancients by discussing Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. And something I forgot to mention earlier on, but Jennifer alluded to it, is that the Heroes of the City of Man, as well as the Theogony and the books we're discussing this month, are part of the challenge for curriculum. And sometimes people wonder why they're at the end, because you can look at other classical schools and programs or curriculum. They often do the ancients when the children are in the beginning of a cycle of learning. And I chose to have them at the end because I felt like their stories were so much, well, one, they were removed, like Jennifer talked about earlier, but they also are bigger stories in so many ways. And I wanted to give our students time with the familiar stories, those of their homeland and of our civilization, before we dug into books that were not so familiar. Because I think the classical education is about the arts of learning more than the content of learning. And so our order is flipped, trying to make it more approachable to students and giving them time to get to the place. And then like think of the big questions we're asking now and the things Jennifer's sharing about this challenge 4 she's leading this year. They're ready for this stuff at this older age. So that's why we do what we do.
Yeah,
Hey,
and
Jennifer.
our theme all year in Challenge 4 is leadership. And having just finished the Iliad with with my group of kiddos, young adults, there are many, many lessons to ponder in the Iliad about leadership and persuading people to the good. And so it's nice to have them be mature and ready to step into roles of leadership as they're reading those words.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then the other point is to go back to people who want to have more of a timeline at home of their literature. This is why we've put together the Echoes books, and they're at a more approachable level for younger children. So we have something for every age, but that's the reason it's in Challenge 4. These books we're talking about now. Thanks, Jennifer.
All right, so now we'll do a close reading of a couple passages from Lightheart, and occasionally we'll also quote from the Theogony because Lightheart does. So we're gonna cover a little bit of a close reading of both books. So Tim, I think our first passage is from page 57 in my edition of Heroes of the City of Man. Do you want to read that for us?
Sure. So it starts with a quote from Hesiod, and it's the words of the Muses as Hesiod has told them. So it's sort of a double quotation here. They say, "Shepherds that camp in the wild, disgraces, merest bellies. We know to tell many lies that sound like truth, but we know how to sing reality when we will." The Muses give Hesiod a branch of springing bay to pluck for a staff, and breathe into me wondrous voice. These gifts, he says, equip him to celebrate things of the future and things that were aforetime, especially concerning the gods and the Muses themselves. The staff is a mark of authority, and Hesiod's initiation as a poet has overtones of investiture as a priest or a prophet. Like Moses on the Mount of Yahweh, Hesiod claims that he has been visited by gods and become their mouthpiece.
Wow, I chose this one because I really wanted to think about this comparison between, the poet being inspired by the Muses and the prophets being invested by God with their job and also with their writings. So what did you guys think about this?
It's an apt comparison because Moses is the one who gave us the book of Genesis, right? So God inspired the origin story of the world, not the origin story of God. It's important to note, right? That God, our God, doesn't have an origin story because he has always been and always will be. But the origin of man and the earth and the things created are all given by inspiration of God. And so similarly here, Hesiod is claiming sort of divine inspiration, but in a sense, he's acknowledging that the Muses both tell lies and truth. And again, that's a real big distinction between a prophet of God and a prophet of the Muses.
Let me ask a question. Are the Muses is in the prose part of this. The shepherds that are not singing reality but telling lies, are they also Muses? Is that what this passage is saying?
I think they're his audience. So they're Hesiod's audience. So they're like the direct address noun. He's calling their attention. Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard to tell from that passage the way he excerpted it. Yeah. It's interesting because, well, I don't want to go down too much down a rabbit trail, but Hesiod does claim to be a shepherd, singing to shepherds, which is also an interesting feature of the Theogony. Because we probably don't think about that as being the purpose of epic poetry. So anyway.
I think that's really great to be reminded of that, that this was the poetry of the people. This wasn't like a high poetry that was only delivered in sort of the courts of the rich and the powerful, but this was the way that culture was transmitted, and stories of the people were told from one generation to the next.
Yeah, and they really were for everyone.
I love how he asks for help to make his singing delightful, and that he recounts that they put the song in his mouth. It makes me think of rhetoric. Ought to be delightful. Poetry certainly helps beautify rhetoric.
I was taken by saying the future and things that were for time instead of past. Thought I need to use that word more.
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, and I was thinking too, Brittany, what you said, that we hope that our own students will be able to have beautiful words. I often find myself making that argument at when I'm speaking to parents that, you know, I don't want your child to learn anaphora so that they can sound smarter than everyone in the room. I want their words to be compelling so that they can spread the truth in a beautiful way.
Yeah, these epic poems were so important to them that one of the muses was actually solely responsible for that inspiration of these epic poems, right? Calliope was the muse of epic poetry, to be distinguished from all other kinds of poetry. This is an important thing, an important part of their culture and art.
Yeah, and you see throughout the Iliad that Homer will pause and call on them yet again in the midst of the action. He will pause and say, "Help me out here to tell about this story." So, oh, good. Well, Brittany, our next quote comes from page 60. And in this quotation, Lightheart suggests that we as moderns have a different conception of the purpose of poetry than the ancients did. And we've sort of already danced around this. So do you want to read this one for us?
Sure. There's the quote from Hesiod directly right after the first line. The muses also have a more public role. Here's Hesiod's words. Whomsoever great Zeus's daughters favor among the kings that Zeus fosters, and turn their eyes upon him at birth, upon his tongue they shed sweet dew, and out of his mouth the words flow honeyed. And the peoples all look to him as he decides what is to prevail with his straight judgments. His word is sure, and expertly he makes a quick end of even a great dispute. This is why there are prudent kings. When the peoples are wronged in their dealings, they make amends for them with ease, persuading them with gentle words. And here's Lightheart. Modern people think poetry is sharply distinct from political life. We read poetry as we listen to music to escape from the clamor of the public square. For Hesiod and the Greeks, however, poetry and political rhetoric come from the same source.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's why I said what I did about the Iliad, because I was so struck reading it with my students this time, how often Homer really is teaching them how to make decisions together in community. You think that the Iliad is this fierce slaughter, and there's plenty of that. There are plenty of gory descriptions of the way people died and got disemboweled and had spears through their eyes and all that. But I'm always struck every time I reread it, and this is many, many rereadings now, that action is interspersed with very long scenes of the Greeks persuading each other to take the right action. And you have this character of Nestor who's there. He can't fight anymore because he's old, but he's there giving them wisdom. And you have other characters speaking wisdom. But I loved this idea of, you know, they shed sweet dew on the tongue of the king, and out of his mouth the words flow honeyed. That was probably my favorite part of Theogony this time.
It makes me think about how moderns also like they're like action and youth and vitality is honored and the wisdom part isn't so much. And it sounds like from this passage that the Greeks had a little better balance of the two.
Yeah, we draw a really stark line between prose and poetry, and even in our writing and our literature, and certainly in public speaking, as Lightheart points out here. Uh, but the poetry that we find in prose is what makes the prose beautiful, right? I think we sort of have this intellectual bent toward prose, right? We want it to be just the facts, ma'am, when people are telling us things. But at the same time, when we hear the beautiful words, we want that, and that does move us. And so, Brittany pointed out that there's a relationship with rhetoric, even in this poetry, even this epic poems that aren't an argument per se, and yet, like you were pointing out, Jennifer, with Homer, he was showing his audience what it means to be Greek, right? What does it mean to be part of the people? And that's what people should want to live up to. And so I think the beautiful poetry helps to elevate in our mind's eye the good, and to bring down the evil to the place where it's obvious to us.
I don't know why, but this brings to my memory when Lily was about 3. Some of you have heard this. I was in the woods with her, and I just always talk to the kids when I'm with them. And so we sat down on our hike, and I sat on like a little elevated area of the path. I wasn't on a log or anything. And I told her a story while she sat across from me. And then she said, it's my turn. And she made me move so she could sit on that little elevated patch and tell her story. And I was so struck by her recognizing like the seat of authority, and that I got the privilege of modeling that for her, even though that's not what I was doing. And so just having good words inspires even our little babies.
Like that.
Yeah. It's funny sometimes how intuitive they are to those nuances, isn't it? And honestly, they also appreciate these ancient stories, the ones that we can give them that are appropriate to them. I found that when I was reading the children's Homer to my kids, or stories from the Echoes books, there's no question that they gravitated toward these stories.
Yeah, Homer knew the power of the poets. Or not Homer, Plato knew the power of the poets. Socrates in the Republic advocates for banning the poets from the city because they were basically teaching loose morals and bad things about the gods. And so rather than telling them to stop doing that, he said, just kick them out of the city, because they're gonna have a bad influence on the people.
Yeah.
Well, that's why Socrates got in trouble, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because his philosophy was great, but couldn't compete with the power of the poems.
Well, we're going to keep thinking about this idea of speech in our next passage. So this is the last one we'll take today. And this is from page 61. So Lee, can you read this one for us?
Sure. Israel's prophets attacked her sins and delivered Yahweh's offer of mercy. Their role was necessarily a public and even political one. Yet Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets were all poets, delivering the oracles of God in language of astonishing power and beauty. Taking a more recent example, try to think of the civil rights movement without thinking of Martin Luther King Jr.'s resonant and poetic evocation of a world without prejudice. I Have a Dream is a moving poem. It's also shrewd policy. See, that's why I like the book so much, and thought it was so helpful both in Shakespeare and in these books, is Lightheart writing from a Christian perspective, as well as current events, as well as understanding the literature and its history so very well. And then here, the history of scripture being brought in. They're just really excellent books. And it's really, again, I said this last month, It hurts my heart when children will leave the curriculum in order to go to a community college when I know they're never going to get to read things like this ever again with other Christians.
Yeah. Yes. And if they stay in 3 and 4, there's so many times where they get to really see this idea in action, that that you have public speech that can be beautiful. If you look at, because in challenge 3, we're looking at US history, and I know my students and I had a long conversation about the short speech that is Gettysburg Address, and how that helped those few but beautiful and moving words held together a nation that was fractured. Where we spent a lot of time that year also talking about World War II and the power of Churchill's words.
Yes.
And how he inspired and held together a world. Forget nation for a minute. He ended up being a spokesperson for the, for the Allies, and he held together people with the power of his words. So
I think the one that always strikes me is the St. Crispin's Day speech from Henry V, and how off that's echoed across books and movies. If you watch Independence Day or Braveheart, those movies practically rip off almost directly the portions of the St. Crispin's Day speech, and that power of the beautiful words put together in a way that resonates with the heart of the listener is extremely motivating.
It's memorable. It ties those things down into our souls and shapes our imaginations too, and what we love. Obviously Martin Luther King was shaped by those things that he'd read. He knew to draw on those things in that speech and in other things that he wrote, even from memory, writing letters from prison. It makes me think of sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, Brittany, I thought you were finished. Please finish your thought.
No. I was just thinking about the previous quote about the link in the Greek mind between spoken politics, political speech, and this poetry in it. Then I was thinking about how Plato advocates for good citizens that can build a good city, a good citizen, a good family, good city and nation, a state. I think these great stories that we get to read with our children are shaping what they love, and by God's grace, their affections, so that they can be good citizens and can remember these things at the appropriate moment when they need it.
Yeah. Lee, earlier you mentioned how you put these at the end, which is a reverse order from what a lot of curricula do. And I think it's wonderful because they start to gather the threads, right? As they've read Shakespeare and they've read these other political speeches and they've read history, they start to gather them together. And when they get to Homer and Virgil, they see those echoes that have come down to us in history, and they start to recognize them and say, oh, this is like, and that's like, and oh, so-and-so just stole straight from Homer, right? And but the storehouses of their mind have been filled with all those things along the way. And then we hope, I think, that they go forth as leaders, as speakers and rhetoricians and poets in their own right, to go out into the world to make use of all those things that they've learned and stored away. And hopefully they can speak persuasively because they can draw on the beauty and the power of the poems and the stories that they've learned along the way.
Something for a parent who feels like their child's not either from maturity or lack of interest, it doesn't get the things we're talking about in challenge 3 and 4. I just want to leave them with another vision of that. If your child did the work and shows up, it's in them. They may not have read the book well, they might have not known what to discuss, but like I remember one of my children coming back 2 or 3 years after challenge and saying, I need words like the guys in challenge had. He was trying to share the gospel with somebody, and I was like, we share the Bible, and he goes, no, this kid won't listen to the Bible. I need other words that'll get him to the Bible, right? And so he didn't have them, but he knew they existed.
Yeah. Yes. And I've had a couple of moments lately. One is a realization with my students that that some of the beauty of speech is to rouse your hearts to righteous anger in the face of great evil and injustice. So we've talked a lot about that lately, and what's our role and what are our proper responses in our culture. And then just to piggyback on what you said, Lee, we always feel like they're done when we send them out the door after challenge 4 or wherever we set. My adult kids now come back all the time and say, can I borrow this book? I need to reread this now that I'm older and more mature. I only understood this much of it. And so it's not over. And the beauty of homeschooling is that you're still, even when they're adults, they're coming back to you because you were the teacher. So they come back to you to ask for more. And to have those continued conversations and to borrow your copies of the books, and then you buy them their own, and it's
That's
beautiful.
great.
It's glorious.
I'm glad we all like our kids.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes people have said to me, why'd you homeschool? And I'm like, because I like my kids. I mean,
It's not always pretty and easy, but man, I wouldn't trade an hour
Yeah.
of the hardest
well,
day.
we're at the end. We're at the other side where we know those hours are fleeting.
They are, yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for preparing such a great discussion, and Brittany and Tim for showing up. Thanks, Emma, for producing, and we'll see everybody next week.
Sounds good. See you then.
Sounds great.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.